me waiting. Please.
Are you the first?
The first what?
Out of control. The most terrifying creation of the universe has been unleashed.
When most people think of 1980s science fiction, they picture Back to the Future, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, or E.T., uplifting blockbusters that defined the decade. But under that glossy surface, there was a darker current of filmmaking. The 1980s were also an era when directors were pushing boundaries, testing how far sci-fi could go in exploring sex, violence, politics, and the darkest corners of the human mind. And Hollywood didn't always approve. Some of these films were censored, others were banned outright, and a few were buried by their own studios, deemed too disturbing, too dangerous, or too controversial for mainstream audiences. Today, we're counting down 10 controversial sci-fi movies of the 1980s that Hollywood tried to ban, censor, or silence. Number 1. Videodrome, 1983. David Cronenberg was no stranger to controversy, but with Videodrome, he created something so disturbing that it rattled even seasoned critics. The story follows Max Wren, played by James Woods, a sleazy cable TV station owner who discovers a pirate broadcast featuring torture, violence, and murder. But the deeper he investigates, the more he falls into a surreal nightmare where television itself infects the human mind and body. The film was unlike anything audiences had seen before. The infamous scenes of flesh merging with machines, television screens pulsating like living organs, and guns fusing with human hands were labeled grotesque and pornographic by some censors. In Canada and the UK, the film was heavily trimmed. In other regions, it was outright banned. To censors, it was too sexually explicit, too violent, and too weird to be allowed in theaters. But that very weirdness made Videodrome a cult classic. Today, it's hailed as a prophetic masterpiece, warning us of the dangers of mass media long before the internet and social media. But back in the 80s, Videodrome wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. 2. Scanners, 1981. Before Videodrome, Cronenberg had already shocked audiences with Scanners, the film that gave us one of the most infamous scenes in movie history, the exploding head. The premise was simple but terrifying. A group of psychics with telepathic and telekinetic abilities are hunted and manipulated by powerful corporations. But what made the film infamous was its brutal special effects. When Michael Ironside's villain demonstrates his psychic powers by making a man's head explode in slow motion, it became an instant legend. Censors weren't impressed. In the UK and Germany, the film was threatened with bans. Some TV broadcasts cut entire minutes of footage, reducing the film to a confusing mess. Critics described it as gratuitous violence disguised as art. But like most controversial films, Scanners thrived underground. VHS tapes circulated, audiences whispered about the exploding head movie, and it became a rite of passage for horror and sci-fi fans. Cronenberg wasn't just making shock cinema, he was exploring themes of corporate control, human evolution, and the dangers of unchecked power. Yet in the eyes of Hollywood and the censors, all that mattered was the gore. 3. The Man Who Fell to Earth, re-release in 1980s. Though originally made in 1976, Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth was reissued in the 1980s, where it became one of the most censored sci-fi films of its time. Starring David Bowie as an alien stranded on Earth, the film explored greed, addiction, and the corruption of innocence. But what rattled Hollywood was the graphic, sexual content. Bowie's character is subjected to exploitation, and the film shows explicit encounters mixed with surreal imagery. By the 1980s, when studios attempted to give it a wider release, entire sequences were cut or banned outright in the US, Britain, and parts of Europe. Critics accused the film of blending pornography with science fiction. In fact, some theaters refused to screen it at all, fearing backlash. What should have been a visionary exploration of loneliness and capitalism was instead buried under scandal. Today, it's celebrated as an art house masterpiece. But back then, it was seen as a threat. 4. Hardware, 1990 but censored in late 80s. Hardware is technically from 1990, but it was filmed and censored during the tail end of the 80s, and its controversy earns it a spot here. Directed by Richard Stanley, the movie follows a killer robot unearthed in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, rebuilt by a scavenger, and unleashed inside an apartment. It was violent, disturbing, unapologetic. Scenes of mutilation, stalking, and sexual assault caused the MPAA to give it an X rating, a death sentence for wide distribution. It was eventually trimmed, but even in censored form, critics called it one of the most shocking sci-fi films of its era. Banned in Ireland and censored in Britain, Hardware became a cult classic for being too brutal to ignore. It showed what could happen when sci-fi met grindhouse horror, and Hollywood wanted nothing to do with it. 5. RoboCop, 1987. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop may be a cult classic today, but back in 1987, it was one of the most controversial movies ever made. The film's dystopian vision of corporate America, where a murdered cop is resurrected as a cybernetic enforcer, shocked audiences, not just with its violence, but with its satire. Censors were horrified by the graphic gore. The scene where Murphy is brutally executed by criminals, his hand blown off, and body shredded with bullets, was so extreme the MPAA initially slapped the film with an X rating. The director was forced to cut nearly a minute of footage to secure an R. But beyond the violence, RoboCop struck a nerve because it dared to mock American capitalism, corporate greed, and the rise of militarized policing. For some politicians and watchdog groups, that was just as offensive as the bloodshed. Yet despite the bans and edits, RoboCop thrived, becoming one of the most important sci-fi films of the decade. 6. Brazil, 1985. Terry Gilliam's Brazil might be the most infamous example of Hollywood censorship in the 1980s. The film is a nightmarish satire about a totalitarian bureaucracy, blending Orwellian dystopia with absurd dark comedy. But Universal Pictures hated it. The studio considered it unmarketable, too bleak, too weird, too un-American. Executives demanded cuts, forcing Gilliam into a year-long war against the studio. At one point, Universal even shelved the movie entirely. Gilliam fought back by secretly screening it for critics, who hailed it as a masterpiece. Eventually, Universal was forced to release it, but only in a heavily cut Love Conquers All version. In other words, one of the greatest sci-fi films of the 80s was almost destroyed by its own studio. 7. The Running Man, 1987, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Running Man seemed like a typical 80s action flick on the surface. But dig deeper and you'll see why it caused such controversy. The film imagines a future where reality TV is a brutal blood sport, with criminals forced to fight for their lives on live television. It was a chilling critique of media manipulation, government propaganda, and America's growing obsession with violent entertainment. Censors tried to cut down its gore, while critics attacked it for being too close to reality. The idea of television networks exploiting human suffering hit a little too close to home. Some countries even briefly banned it, claiming it glorified violence. But today, The Running Man feels more prophetic than ever, predicting the rise of reality TV and the blurred line between entertainment and cruelty. 8. Akira, 1988. In 1988, Akira changed animation forever, but it also terrified Western distributors. Katsuhiro Otomo's anime masterpiece is a violent, neon-soaked epic about psychic powers, corrupt governments, and the collapse of Tokyo. Its jaw-dropping visuals and cyberpunk aesthetic made it iconic, but its violence and disturbing body horror made it controversial. In America, early distributors hesitated to release it. In Britain, censors cut several minutes of gore. Some countries outright refused to screen it, labeling it too extreme for animation. The irony? That controversy helped make it a legend. Akira wasn't just another anime, it became the blueprint for cyberpunk storytelling. 9. Altered States, 1980. Directed by Ken Russell, Altered States told the story of a scientist experimenting with sensory deprivation tanks and hallucinogenic drugs. The result was a psychedelic descent into madness and evolution. But what made it controversial wasn't just the surreal visuals, it was the drug themes. Religious groups attacked the film for promoting psychedelics. Others condemned its body horror, where the protagonist evolves into primal forms of life. In several countries, it faced censorship for blasphemy and drug glorification. Yet the film asked real questions about consciousness, evolution, and the human soul. For censors, however, it was just too dangerous. 10. They Live, 1988. John Carpenter's They Live may be one of the most important sci-fi films of all time, and one of the most controversial. The premise is simple. A drifter discovers sunglasses that reveal the truth, that aliens secretly control the world, manipulating humanity through advertising and media. It was sharp, angry, and unapologetically political. Critics slammed it as anti-capitalist propaganda. Some accused Carpenter of making an anti-government, even subversive film. Certain TV networks refused to play it, and yet They Live endured. Its infamous line, "I came here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum," became a pop culture legend. More importantly, the film's message about hidden control and media manipulation feels more relevant now than ever. The 1980s gave us blockbusters and popcorn fun, yes, but it also gave us films that challenged authority, exposed corruption, and pushed the limits of what sci-fi could be. Some were censored, some were banned, some were buried by their own studios. But all of them proved one thing. Science fiction isn't just about spaceships and laser guns. It's about truth. And sometimes truth is dangerous. So the next time you think of 80s sci-fi, don't just remember E.T. or Star Wars. Remember the films that Hollywood tried to silence, the ones that refused to play it safe. Because in the end, those are the ones that still matter.